Like, instead of getting rid of him, all they have done is get more and more and more people to support him, including Democrats who previously never would have even thought of voting for him, except that they see that what's being done with Trump on every level is wrong.
I'm Stephanie Keith.
And I am Tara Manjekovich, and we are unapologetically outspoken.
Hey everyone, happy Friday. All right, I don't really want to talk about this because it pisses me off so much, but we're going to talk about Trump getting kicked off the ballot in Colorado because we just have to. So, in case you've been living under a rock, the Colorado Supreme Court voted 4-3 to remove Donald Trump from the primary ballot in the state under the Constitution's insurrection clause. This is the first time in history that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment has been used to disqualify a presidential candidate. So they're taking the presidential candidate that is leading everyone in the polls off the ballot because of his role in the January 6th insurrection. I'm using air quotes. So let's get the facts, okay? Donald Trump was never charged with inciting an insurrection. There are no criminal charges against him for January 6th. The January 6th committee that put on this whole big show failed to show any evidence of Trump inciting violence. We also know from the Twitter files that he asked for everyone to be peaceful, and they deleted that tweet. Yet the Supreme Court of Colorado is taking him off the ballot because of a crime that he was never charged with. So the Democrats that are always crying about the threat to democracy are now destroying democracy? Like, Tara, make it make sense for me.
Well, first, I think we have to clarify that according to the Colorado Supreme Court's ruling, their decision was based on basically just the way they decided to interpret the 14th Amendment, because the language doesn't specify that anyone has to be convicted of an insurrection or even charged with an insurrection. It only states that the 14th Amendment prohibits anyone who, quote, engaged in an insurrection. And if that's the case, they can't hold public office. But the 14th Amendment it's from back in 1868, and it was intended to prevent Confederates from holding government positions after the Civil War. So really, it's semantics and it's open to interpretation. But in order for this to make sense, honestly, we have to transport ourselves to bizarro world, where the term democracy is actually a code word for authoritarianism or communism, socialism, whatever you want to call it. And sadly, this isn't even bizarro world, because this is becoming the reality of our actual world. I mean, that's what's happening here. It's a very purposeful transition away from the concept of democracy. And we all know that if this was Biden or really any other Democrat and not Trump, the interpretation of the 14th Amendment would be completely different. And they would argue that he wasn't convicted of anything and he didn't actually take a role in what was going on. And so it would be a completely different story. But since it's Trump, the rules are not the same. And this has been proven time and time and time again with every single accusation and investigation and charge against Trump for the past few years. And you mentioned in the beginning of this podcast that this is the first time in history that this amendment has been used to disqualify a presidential candidate. It's all of the firsts that have been happening with Trump over the last couple of years. And it's to the point where anyone who doesn't recognize what's happening, I'm sorry, but you have mental issues and you should not be allowed to even vote in the first place. Because whether you love or hate Trump, if you can't see that everything happening has been an incredibly obvious, in your face, one-sided hypocritical witch hunt focused on Trump for the past few years, not only do you need a lesson in ethics and morals, but you need a lesson in the basics of what democracy is. And to be clear, America is not a democracy. It was created as a constitutional federal republic, but we constantly refer to it as a democracy. And the concept of democracy in the United States is supposed to be in the form of the people governing themselves through the democratic process of voting for our representatives in free and fair elections. which we don't even have those anymore. So if we even just simplify things to the definition of democracy, a true democracy is based on the fundamental freedoms that are expressed by the will of the people through voting. And I don't think this decision by the Colorado Supreme Court was remotely decided by the will of the people. It was a decision made for the people. And what does that do? It essentially takes away the power of the people to decide with their own vote. And that's what an authoritarian government does. It's what a communist government does. It's what a socialist government does. And Newt Gingrich made a comment after the ruling came down, and he said, quote, "They have replaced the rule of law with the rule of power. Welcome to Venezuela or Cuba or Nicaragua," end quote. And he's absolutely correct, because if you take a look at the goal of any authoritarian or totalitarian or communist or socialist, whatever regime, the whole point is to use their strong central power of the established government to preserve the status quo. And they do that by limiting freedom and prohibiting democratic voting. And taking the most popular candidate out of a presidential race with a bullshit ruling based on a bullshit charge and a bullshit investigation in the first place is nothing but fucking bullshit. And it's a clear example of what is the complete opposite of, quote, democracy.
Yeah, you called it. It's total bullshit. And I want to play a clip from Chris Lando, who was the law clerk for Supreme Court Justices Thomas and Scalia, in an interview that he did on Laura Ingraham. So take a listen to this.
Meters are just going off the charts tonight because this is one of the most anti-democratic decisions we have seen in American history, that 4 unelected judges on a state Supreme Court have taken it upon themselves to disqualify someone who otherwise meets all the qualifications that the Constitution imposes from the ballot for President of the United States of America. I think the U.S. Supreme Court will take one look at this and say, well, this cannot stand. So in a sense, that's, I think, the silver lining here, that it won't stand. But it is terrifying to me as an American that this kind of lawfare is being waged, that courts are so presumptuous that they think that it's up to them to decide who can be on the ballot to let democracy work. They're free to dislike Donald Trump. Especially people who don't like Donald Trump should be terrified at this decision, because the worst thing, frankly, for them is to be say the courts took him off the ballot. I mean, we should be able as American citizens to have an adult conversation on this and vote. Why are these people so terrified that they're bending all the rules to get Trump off the ballot? Let the people vote.
Let the people vote. Exactly. Like, how many dangerous precedents have they set so far? This is crazy. And now, essentially any state, red or blue, could take a leading candidate off the ballot.
Yeah, exactly. You even had Lieutenant Governor of Texas, Dan Patrick. He already threatened to remove Biden from the Texas state ballot because he allowed 8 million people to illegally cross the Texas-Mexico border. Like, is that legit? Maybe, maybe not. But again, it's setting the precedent for this kind of activity.
Yeah. And then democracy truly is stolen. Like what they say, it's always, they're always saying threat to democracy. Well, look at who's threatening it. It's the Democrats. So I get that some people hate Trump, like obviously we know this, but why not let the voters decide? Just like he said, let the voters decide that we get that right. And this isn't just an attack on Trump. This is an attack on the people of Colorado, because it takes away their choice in who they want to vote for. And I want to note that even if people like write in his name on the ballot, it's not going to be counted. So they took election interference to a whole new level where they're not even trying to hide it anymore. I mean, the writing's on the wall. They'll stop at nothing to make sure that Trump doesn't get back into the presidency. And Tara, do you think that it's just a coincidence that they make this doomsday movie that shows the end of America right before the election? And then like right after that, they make another movie about civil war? Because in my opinion, like if anything was going to cause a civil war, it would be something like this, taking the leading candidate off the ballot. And they say that history repeats itself. And something that I didn't realize until this morning, actually, is that Abraham Lincoln was removed by the Democrats from the ballot in 10 states. And we all know how that played out. He still became president, but a civil war broke out. So do you think they're purposely trying to create like a civil war and chaos?
Oh yeah, definitely. Like, the Biden administration and its minions throughout the country, they have all sold their souls and they've sold out America in all areas of government, whether you're talking local, state, or federal, like they will stop at nothing to keep the Biden administration in power. And it's like at this point, they have to realize that every move they've made against Trump has backfired, right? Like instead of getting rid of him, all they have done is get more and more and more people to support him, including Democrats who previously never would have even thought of voting for him, except that they see that what's being done with Trump on every level is wrong. Like he's leagues ahead of any other Republican candidate by such a huge margin that I'm sorry, but I still think the primary debates are just a joke, but he's the clear leading candidate. And so they know that if he's on the ballot, he's going to win. And so far, every move that the left has made to keep him from being eligible for election, they've all tanked. Like we've talked about how they might try to stop the election by means of, another more deadly pandemic or getting us involved in World War III. But when you think about it, like what better way to stop an election than to create civil chaos from within? Like all they have to do is bring in the weaponized FBI and military troops to round up all the real Americans and put them in COVID camps, except they can just change the name to like domestic terrorist insurrection camp instead. And like, why not just throw a cyber attack in there for fun to keep us all from communicating? And then they can blame it on foreign terrorist activity and lock down the country for safety. And when you lock down the country, then we can't have elections. So any way you look at it, like we are just fucked if Americans do not get rid of this political bullshit and come together as one party to take down our corrupt government and stop the destruction of our country.
Yeah. And that's exactly where my mind was going when I first heard this. Like, maybe they want the chaos so that there's martial law and then they can throw, everyone on the right in these like FEMA camps that we know they have set up everywhere. I also want to play a clip from the same show, Laura Ingraham, where she interviewed Jonathan Turley on the way that the court interpreted this. So let's listen to his opinion on this.
Thing that keeps on recurring in your mind is where's the limiting principle here? What would not satisfy this test? At each one of these barriers, the court could have adopted a fairly moderate or more narrow approach, but it didn't. And so on every one of these issues, it really took out all the fail-safes and went to the broadest possible meaning. Well, that means that states could engage in a tit-for-tat type of series of decisions. You could have red states blocking Biden on some ballots and blue states blocking Trump. And the way this is viewed by the public is really quite horrific. They view President Biden on the ropes, and the ref just called the man.
So again, it's like, that's exactly what's happening. And, listening to him, what I can think about is now that they've used this really broad meaning of the law to do this, and all these other states follow suit, whether they're trying to get Biden off the ballot or Trump off the ballot. I mean, think about it. Could they be doing that too to drag this out? Because if this is being dragged out, then maybe we don't have an election in 2024 or we don't have a primary. So it's like, there's no good outcome from this, in my opinion.
No, and either way, we still look like a complete shit show to the rest of the world. Everything that, even though I gave my whole speech about how we're technically not a democracy, every other country looks at America as what democracy is supposed to stand for. And this is like literally a mockery of our own system. And did you see Biden's reaction when he was asked what he thought about all this on Wednesday?
Yep. Typical
Yeah.
Biden.
Oh, yeah. So he was like shuffling across the tarmac to his plane, and a reporter asked him what he thought of the Supreme Court's decision. And like he mumbled that it was up to the courts and walked away. So then she asked him if Trump was an insurrectionist. And it was like he stopped and he gave her a very definitive response. So I want to play what he had to say.
Well, I think it's everything self-evident. You saw it all. Now, whether the 14th Amendment applies, we'll let the court make that decision. But he certainly supported an insurrection. And no question about it. None, zero. And he seems to be doubling down on about everything. Anyway.
Okay, so I just edited out the part the beginning, I guess, where you can't hear anything.
You know what, though? It annoys the shit out of me that they always do this. The only time he'll like answer questions is when there's like a helicopter in the background and they're shouting, because then he has like an easy, excuse to like say something stupid and run off. It's so aggravating.
Yeah. And it's like, what makes me so angry is if you didn't hear what he said in the beginning, like he was very just like whatever about the question. And then when she asked if he was an insurrectionist, like he starts walking towards her, whereas before he was just like walking away to get on the plane, and he starts walking towards her to answer the question. And his one brief moment of clarity, perhaps in his own mind, before returning to his senility. But every single thing that he said was just complete hypocrisy and lies. And it's like I said earlier about how we live in bizarro world. Or you that game you play when you're a kid where you like say the opposite of everything that's true. Like that's exactly the way I view everything that comes out of Biden's mouth and his entire administration, because everything they accuse Trump of is what they themselves have either done or are currently doing. And Trump did not support an insurrection. The Biden administration supported an insurrection. And anyone with an independent thinking brain who's looked beyond the propaganda that was fed to us by mainstream media could see that this was evident. Like to quote Biden, no question about it, none, zero, right? Like even with all the footage and the evidence that was erased from the January 6 tapes and destroyed, there was still enough evidence, and has been from the very beginning, to prove that Trump told everyone to be peaceful and go home, and that it was the Biden administration, we later learned, that literally led people into the Capitol, created the so-called insurrection. And so it's the Biden administration, not Trump, that's doubling down on all the lies, right? It's just so fucking maddening to me that anyone can listen to what comes out of his mouth and believe it to be true.
Yeah, well, it's the same rule that keeps playing out, right? It's like when something comes out about Biden, they attack Trump. So what happened this week? Hunter Biden, was subpoenaed and then he didn't show up. So of course, you just know. I was just sitting there waiting for something to happen to Trump, and then they take him off the ballot every single time. Every time something happens to the Bidens, something bigger happens to Trump.
Yep.
And according to an AP article, the court stayed its decision until January 4th, or until the U.S. Supreme Court rules on the case. So Colorado officials say that the issue must be settled by January 5th. That's the deadline for the state to print its presidential primary ballots. So, I mean, this is going to go to the Supreme Court quickly and be overturned. And in the process, though, it's completely tarnishing the reputation of the court. So, like, what's the point? Again, like, what are they plotting? And Vivek Ramaswamy took to X and he posted, quote, "I pledge to withdraw from the Colorado GOP primary ballot until Trump is allowed to be on the ballot. And I demand that Ron DeSantis, Chris Christie, and Nikki Haley do the same immediately," end quote. And you know what? He's smart because he knows the Supreme Court's going to overturn this. And we've heard Trump saying how, he's incredibly upset with DeSantis for not being loyal. So what I think is that Vivek is trying to like prove to Trump that he's the most loyal. And so he ends up like getting a spot as VP or part of Trump's cabinet. But I mean, this comes after a primary debate where Vivek said that now we know that January 6th was an inside job. I mean, we know that federal agents were in the crowd. Yet they're still trying to say it was an insurrection led by Trump. And I mean, just like you said, Tara, he said peacefully protest beforehand. All those videos are deleted now. He went on Twitter and said, go home. And all of that got deleted. But now we know the truth looking back, and they're still trying to run with this narrative. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, and speaking of Vivek, did you notice he was the first presidential candidate to speak out? Like, I fucking love this guy. And on a total side note, did you hear how he publicly told CNN's Van Jones to shut the fuck up earlier this week?
Yes.
Wasn't that awesome? Like, I know he
Amazing.
has no chance of winning the presidency, but I just, I love that he speaks his mind.
I don't know that he has no chance, because if they're going to do whatever they can to make sure that Trump like can't run. And I think if Trump can't run, I think he could potentially win. Like he seems to be a favorite out of like Nikki Haley, Chris Christie, and DeSantis.
I got to look at the latest polls again because I didn't think he was doing that well, but I totally love him. I wish we could get him on the podcast for an interview. How cool would that be? But getting back to the Trump issue. So as of Wednesday afternoon, the Colorado Republican Party basically said it was going to switch from a primary ballot system to a caucus system if Trump can't be on the ballot. And if you're not sure what a caucus is, because to be perfectly honest, I wasn't sure. I was reading an article in the Epic Times that put it very simply. They stated that while a primary is a state level election where party members choose a candidate to run in a general election, a caucus is basically a local meeting where a party's registered members from a city, town, or county vote for their preferred candidate. So if this whole idiotic decision is upheld, basically, a caucus would allow the Colorado Republican Party to say, fuck you, bypass the primary ballot issue, and GOP members would still be able to elect Trump. But again, the fact that Colorado even went to these lengths to prevent Trump from running is the real issue, because the bottom line is it's all about fear. They're scared because they know that in a legitimate election, he would win hands down. And again, they will do anything to keep that from happening.
Yep. And you know what? I do think there's a lot of Republicans in the deep state and the uniparty that would still try to screw him over. So who knows?
Oh, yeah.
But hopefully by the time we come back from our little break, we'll have some better news on this. I do think the Supreme Court's going to turn it over. So I don't think there's anything to worry about right now. But since Monday is Christmas, I hope that everyone is celebrating with their loved ones and just forgets about all this nonsense and enjoys the holidays. We're not going to have a Monday episode because we're going to be enjoying the holidays with our loved ones. So we'll see you back here on Wednesday with some more updates. Thanks everyone for tuning in. If you're sick of all the crazy shit going on in our country and you want to express your support and patriotism for the show, head on over to our Etsy store at UO Patriot Chicks and check out our new stickers. The link can also be found on our website. If you love the show and you want exclusive episodes, support the podcast and join the conversation by becoming a member of our Patreon community. We'll be posting weekly member-only podcast episodes and content that isn't available on the weekly podcast. Every Patreon member will also get a free Unapologetically Outspoken sticker and updates about our new sticker release before they're made public. And be sure to follow us on TikTok at Unapologetically Outspoken. And if you haven't done so already, please rate and review the podcast. The more you support us, the more people we can reach. So help us spread the word.